Hey everyone. I always like to joke that one of the ways that I learn best is by talking to people who are smarter than me. And fortunately, just about everyone is smarter than me. So I have a lot of great people to choose from. For my project, I selected one person who I know has some really valuable wisdom and insights for each of the 5 domains. And I had 5 separate conversations with these individuals, just telling them a little bit about what I learned, sharing with them some of my goals and objectives as we look towards the next school year, and hearing from them about strategies they've used to be successful in those given domains. So here are each of those conversations, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks for doing this with me.
You're welcome. Yeah, anytime.
All right, so I was learning about learning partnerships, and I found this quote that I thought encapsulated it for me. But I'm interested to hear, like, just based on our reading and discussions, like how you would characterize it. But I wrote down, learning partnerships. To succeed in school, diverse learners need to feel as if they are in partnership with their teachers. To create these relationships, we need to build trust with students, help them develop positive mindsets, and give them the language to talk about their learning. So the first thing that crossed my mind was that, to an extent, I feel like we've been trying to do that already for years. But what's the missing piece? Like, why do we feel like we need to relearn this, or especially for our diverse learners or for our students of color? I think that's the part I've struggled with the most, is like, okay, I've been trying to do that, but maybe in a way that hasn't been successful from the right angle. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or experience with like those learning partnerships specifically to helping like every student be as successful as every other student.
Yeah, I don't know. And the quote resonates with me too, because it covers like all the facets of culturally responsive teaching, that like the student has to have a role in it, or has to have a way to take ownership of it, even through like language. So I don't know, I think the missing piece might be that throughout the years it's easy to take that ownership away just through like everyday education, everyday lessons, everyday assignments. It takes a lot of effort, I think, to give that ownership to a student and to kind of trust them with it too, and to know that that's more worthwhile for them. Yeah, I think sometimes the days go by really slowly for teaching, but then all of a sudden, the months are over, and it's hard to look back and question, did I make every single decision based on the ownership and centering of the student? Like, that's really hard to do. So I think going back and relearning about those partnerships and really zoning in on what you do every single day is important, because it's easy to get wrapped up in just going through the motions.
It makes me think like school is something that like happens to a student.
Yeah.
It's like I have to attend, and then I'm just dictated like what to do the whole way.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we don't really think about it. And maybe some students, they just respond to that, like, okay, you want me to do this? Like, I'm going to do exactly this, and then some.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I could see where if we assume that that's what every student responds to, then you're easily going to leave plenty out.
Right.
What I was thinking about, that last part resonated with me the most. Give them the language to talk about their learning. So I wrote down, I want to give them language to talk about their learning. I want them to be able to discuss, especially in English, like discuss their reading skills, talk about their participation, talk about their level of understanding, talk about their level of written expression and their depth of thinking, like kind of all those CLSs in your Common English class. And we don't frequently talk about the CLSs.
Yeah.
They're kind of addressed like here and there, and we used to have posters sometimes in rooms, but maybe even not focusing on that list so much as so I was just thinking like about talking about growth mindset to get them to be able to have that language, but then just a lot of reflection and self-assessment, like kind of directing them, like giving them the tools, like now we're going to prioritize this by spending class time looking at what you just did,
mm-hmm.
and thinking through how, instead of just getting a grade on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't read much more about like how to give students that language, except just to be explicit with it and build it in. But is that, I don't know if you've read anything about that, or just like about how to help students own their learning and have the language to think about it and to talk about it. But that's what crossed my mind, and I was curious if that seemed relevant.
Yeah, I love that one too. Because I think in English classes as well, it's maybe more built into our lessons already, to have vocabulary and to push vocabulary usage in discussions or Socratic seminars, and even with the use of rubrics, I found really helpful for that. Over the last couple of years, I've become a real big fan of like the one column rubric.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of shows
It's like that
where you meet.
proficiency column. Yeah.
That's the expectation. And then above expectations and areas for growth is undefined, right? So sometimes that vocabulary doesn't even exist yet, and it's kind of created by the student too, which is what I like. Like sometimes that the CLS is already determined, right? It's like academic language, students will be able to, like all the specific structure that even education programs teach incoming teachers. But I like sort of when the standards of what exceeds expectations are determined by the students in that classroom or by the work that they create that year for that assignment. Because I've taught the same assignments, multiple years, and the products are vastly different, but they might exceed in different ways. So I think that's helped me kind of allow students to shape what that is. And a lot of the time I'll use student examples to kind of get them to talk about what that looks like, right? So if these annotations looked completely different than somebody else's, but they were A+, here's why, because we all can see it and talk about it. And it's not just because the rubric says it has this, and this, right? They created it themselves, so that's something I've liked. Other ways to build in like that academic language with CLSs, I would love to see, and I did this kind of in my clinicals at ISU, but we had some rubrics with standards-based categories, and it really just laid out for students what they were doing in that assignment and why. And I don't know, I've never tried that yet, and we don't do standards-based grading here, so that would be something like to try out personally or individually, but I think that would be maybe a way to see or to try to build in some of those things in more regular units or just projects.
Yeah, make it consistent.
They would build off of that. The more you see it, then the more you can understand it and talk about it.
Yeah.
So if that was a consistent piece of grading, that could be another way too. Across the board.
I like that. Or even having students like just maybe determine their own grade, maybe not, or like reflect on that. But also, like we did a seminar discussion with some sophomores last week, and then I built in a reflection afterwards. And I just asked 2 questions, and I was, for most students, a little disappointed with the kind of reflection. The first question was just how did the class do with the discussion, and how did you do with the discussion? And most people wrote like something along the lines of fine. And then the second question was, well, what was something that you learned, like in virtue of the discussion? They're like very generic. I learned more about the main character. Well, what?
Yeah.
Actually, like let's reflect on this. So I think that struck me as a skill. So I like what you're talking about, because it seems like it kind of needs like time and attention as its own skill. It's not on any CLS, but it supplements the building of the CLS skills, because now you have like this process for just like talking through how you went about learning, what your outcome was, and tied together with some of the other tools for ownership. I think that could be really interesting.
Yeah.
All right, well, I could keep talking to you about this, and I will, but I appreciate the time to just help me think through a little bit more about learning partnerships this morning. Hi, Katie.
Hi, George.
So I want to talk about community of learners with you.
Okay.
So let me tell you just a little bit, a smidgen of what I've been thinking about and reading about, and kind of where I want to pick your brain a little bit. So there's a lot that goes into that community. One of the things that I was reading talks about making space for student voice and agency, which I feel like needs to be said. Like it shouldn't need to be said, but it needs to be said.
Yeah.
And the other major part too was building a classroom culture around communal talk and I wrote like task structure, so like just that community involvement with whatever is going on. And I think it needs to be said because what I found is that it can feel very highly individualistic. Like we have like your desk and your work, and keep your eyes on your paper and pay attention to me when I'm talking. So building in those things, I feel like it's been especially challenging this year. So a big part of, I'm saying a lot, I can't wait until next year when.
Right.
Some of this might be easier to facilitate. So looking towards next year, just what I've learned so far, here's a couple of the things that I'm going to try to do, but I know you've been successful in this year and in years past too. I just have good insight on. So one is finding what I call the right elements to rally the class around. I feel like I've experimented with things and found several wrong ones to try. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but like, do you like when you're trying to find like that classroom culture, like what comes to mind for you? What have you done either this year or previous years that you feel like has kind of clicked?
Well, I don't know. I feel like this year, what's honestly helped is one, the kids being in person, right? And that's going to be the case this year, next year, and years past, all the time. Like them being physically in front of us helps. But honestly, like the 15-minute passing period that we have here has really helped to further connect with those kids. And part of our culture, like we have developed in that 15 minutes. Because I have a class of freshmen where, half of them are in person. And so when they get there in the first 5 minutes of the passing period, like we just talk about, their weekends or their hobbies or their activities, and then that gives me a sense of where they are that day and what I can kind of work into the lesson with other kids, or I can ask the Zoom kids when they get there. So that's been a huge thing this year, is just, it shouldn't have to be said, right? Get to know your students and connect with your students, but it's one of those things that does have to be said because this year in particular, we've been on technology and we're still looking at the computer, but we have live people in front of us. And so it's, how do you find that balance? So that's been one thing. I feel like another thing, like you were saying, right? You sit in your desk, you listen to me when I'm talking, look at what you're doing, focus on you. But I think just the language that we use matters as well. I find myself using we more frequently. What do we think about that? Rather than one person, and trying to pinpoint it out, like, what are our thoughts on that? Or how do we feel about that? So I think just the language that we're using as well. It's a small change, but it's one that I guess has worked all right. And, just giving them wait time.
Changes the mind frame a little bit.
It changes the mind frame a little bit, and it does make it more of kind of like a collective, right? It's not singling out a person about how do you as an individual feel about this, but it's what's our vibe right now? Like, how do we feel about this? We just did the trial scene in To Kill a Mockingbird. Well, nobody really wants to talk about how they as an individual maybe feel about, Mayella getting attacked or Tom being found guilty. But if we open it up to kind of a more collective mindset, we can start there and kind of chip away and work towards those more individualistic things. When I think so much and so often, we're trying to do the opposite. Okay, like it'll be easier for me to build up to everybody talking if I start with an individual. Sometimes you have to do the reverse.
Interesting. Yeah, because one thing I thought about, and this is one of my questions too, was like, what about introverted students?
Yep.
So a number of years ago, I was kind of introduced to like Susan Cain and The Power of the Introvert. And it talked about the extrovert ideal, how a lot of schools had shifted to just thinking out loud, being collaborative, and really there's a strong case for a lot of students prefer. So that's actually one thing I've tried to build in. So we read a relatively intense scene in our book with our sophomores last week, and that was the first thing that I asked them to do is just reflect on this. What does this evoke? And then from there, especially over Zoom, where I don't just want to cold call on someone,
right?
Just be like, now you've had a chance to process. I can actually see, thanks to Google Docs, what each individual has. now let's use this as a little bit of traction for how we engage with one another. And I feel like that's good, at least as a class discussion. I don't know if that reaches community of learners to the extent that it could, but it's at least one tool that I've used as well.
Yeah. I found, I think I have a lot of either incredibly extroverted people or that, incredibly introverted people. And then I think this year in particular, a middle ground of, I just, maybe don't have the effort to put into it today.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to make it just seem like I'm nervous and don't want to say anything, and then that little bubble that you rarely hear from. So to try to get everybody's voices involved, I found like Pear Deck was really helpful this year because they could do it anonymously. Like they could put in an answer and I could at least see where were we struggling as a class, as opposed to like, each individual student that's struggling. But it's like, okay, do we as a class need to further review this chapter? Are we confident with, the task that we're working on, or do we have questions that we just aren't asking?
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that I was actually getting more honest answers of kids putting in there, I'm so sorry, like I don't know,
Yeah.
like I'm not sure. And just the rate of responses told me a lot about the whole, because if there were, 23 kids that were on it, but only 10 had responded and it had been a minute or two, I was like, okay, well, get something in there, like get your thoughts in there. And, it at least helped me kind of gauge like, okay, this one we're answering pretty quickly and I'm getting a lot of responses. This one, not so much. You could even tell day by day, and that was huge. The other thing that we've done this year that I want to figure out how to replicate for next year is when we do kind of large group summative discussions like seminars, is we've had kids this year join in the chat. And if they're at home especially, like that's one way that they could still get credit and still get their ideas out there, was even if it wasn't the question or two that they originally signed up for and signed up and did all of this prep work for, they could still engage in the conversation. Yeah. They could still respond.
So how do you use it? So I like the idea of kind of almost like a little back channel.
Mm-hmm.
Like are you,
mm-hmm.
is everyone then like privy to that and responding to it, or is that something you would see like after the conversation? You can see some of the additional input.
Usually it would, the time that we've done it, I kept reminding them like, hey, look at the chat, because we either have some kids that are truly like introverted and like nervous to speak, or they're afraid that, what they have to say has either already been said or isn't good enough. And I'm like, well, neither of those is true, but okay, like put what you have in the chat. As soon as your question comes up, you can hit enter, and it's out there. So I encourage them to use it as a kind of jumping off point as well, and say like, okay, you're chatting, there's a lull, look at the chat, see what you missed, try to stay up with that. So trying to be in the moment with it.
Yeah, I think of like when it's so individualized, it's I think relatively easy for a student to feel like, the only thing I have at stake is myself, and I guess learned helplessness or whatever. Like I'm just okay with not doing this or not doing that great on it.
Yeah.
But I feel like the community helps them move beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
And just in what I've read, and maybe my understanding is like, no, it's like you have a stake, almost like a commitment to your class, or you're involved in something that's a little bit beyond you, and that's harder just to walk away from. But it's a feel, like even if you directly say some of those things, you have to feel it and you have to own it, and everyone has to feel like they're also. I know Hammond uses a term I can't get to mind right now, but like you're almost aware of what other people in the room are doing as well. Like this person isn't doing as well. Like let me interact with them in a way that helps build their efficacy. And then that's where the pressure's off the teacher to individualize that attention. And so just trying to think through, it takes, I feel like, a lot of creativity and a lot of energy to achieve. And that's why one of the things I wrote down, that when I wrote the rituals they don't have to be directly centered around an academic task. That's the goal, obviously. But it could really relate to anything that builds that community. but also it'll probably like change year to year too.
Yes.
Which makes it really challenging because when you find something that really works, and then at the beginning of the next year, when you have a new group and you try that same thing, like it takes time to kind of feel out what does work and then reimagine how to implement that to the same success year after year.
Yeah, for sure. And I think of, one of the rituals that we've started is at the beginning of class, like whether it's speech or drama or whatever, we have some sort of kind of like getting our minds, bodies, and all of that into the present moment. And so we will stretch every day. And we'll start out and we'll just kind of take some deep breaths together. We'll stretch, relax, get into, shake out everything that's been past and come straight into the present. And that's, I think, really helped to kind of focus the energy to maybe get some people warmed up and just like awake, whether it's first hour, fourth hour, or whenever. And it's one of those where it's like I'm kind of trusting the kids that are at home with their cameras off, like, hey, we're doing this anyway, so hopefully you're engaging in it. But the kids that are in person are, and sometimes they're just like, oh yeah, we gotta stretch. So that's been one thing that's been really nice, to just like, we're gonna take this time for ourselves, but together.
Yeah.
Like nobody's doing this by themselves.
That's true. It'd be really lame if there's just one person.
Right, and it's usually the one person would be me, and
Right.
so I'm like,
So you put yourself out there. And,
right? Like I did it when everybody was at home anyway, and I did it with every single class when everybody was at home. So it might have just been me some days in the green room stretching by myself, but you know what? Like I felt really great. I had a great day after I did that, so it was fine.
Yeah, I've heard one student really articulated it well, where he's like, I come into school because when I was at home, and he was home for most of the year, it's like I felt like school was something that was happening over there.
Right. There's a separation.
Exactly. And so you could like passively watch it, like you would watch like a sporting event, but it doesn't feel like you're a part of it.
Right.
And so I think obviously like at least trying to do those things that make people feel a part of it this year are good. But looking forward to next year when you do have like that physical proximity, or your classroom is itself like a little community, in like whether you want to or not, it's a community. You just have to define the culture that goes into it.
Right, because the environment's so different. I'm sure I've got a bunch of kids that are on Zoom that are usually chatting everybody up in class, and they usually, I don't even know which kids know each other this year.
Yeah.
Aside from my freshmen, because half of them are in that community that you're talking about, where the kids kind of take ownership and advocacy. I see that with them, where I know where their friend groups are, and they've told me that they have a group chat titled English Class, where they remind each other of homework, and they call each other out, for being late or not on Zoom, or, like they will take care of it. They've called kids at, like, I don't know, class starts at 9:30, at like 9:28, they're calling and FaceTiming their friends. They're like, why aren't you in class? So it's been really nice that I know that one group is kind of looking out for each other in that respect and kind of helping each other out. So it's like, okay, well, you can explain the project, you've done the project, you're helping your friend. That's really, that takes a little bit off of my plate. So
yeah,
it's really neat to see.
Nice. Well, thank you for sharing some time with me to talk through
absolutely.
this. First room, best room.
First room, best room! Woo!
I'm looking forward to more chats with you. All right, so we'll talk about student agency and independence. So I'm learning a lot about this. And I think that there's a lot that we've talked about over the years. I just think as educators that this comes up. So thinking about it from that culturally responsive lens, one of the big things that Hammond talks about is teaching students how to learn, but also with that the counter narratives, like we're just in the last chapter that we looked at. And I think that's really important. And what I wrote down and kind of what I wanted to think about with you was how to help students focus not just on what they're learning, but that they're learning, is the way I'm phrasing it to myself.
Okay.
So I feel like I kind of know how to do that, but at the same time, it's usually not my approach. Usually I'm like, here's the content, here's today's task, let's do this, and if you do this and you move on. And I think that's resulted, at least this year, in relatively, or surprisingly low engagement, or lower engagement than I expected, just with the academic task. So what I want to think about with you is how to get students to think about their learning and feel a little bit more ownership and buy-in to that process. And I'm thinking more towards next year where we'll probably have more traditional setup.
Right. And I think being a science teacher, we have some options that you guys may or may not have. Switching to our NGSS, our science standards, has allowed us a chance to try and have the kids look at the fact that they're learning for a purpose. And it's not just, here's a chunk, and here's a chunk, and here's a chunk. But years and years and years ago, gee whiz, at least 10 years ago now, you remember Rich Gross. He and I took a class on problem-centered learning. It was problem-based learning, but that has no end. And we're like, no, we have to end. So we made it problem-centered learning. And one thing that I've done with my kids throughout the year is whatever we learn on day one, we have to use at the end. So
is that like within a given unit?
Yeah, no,
or?
there are. I don't do units anymore. It's we are constructed only by grading periods. So whatever we learn August 8th, August 12th, you have to know on December 21st because we're going to use it. And not because it's a final exam, but as we're looking at that scientific method, every unit I bring in scientific method. And I go, okay, so what are your observations now? We learned about that in scientific method. You don't get to forget it just because we finished that unit in September. You have to use your observations. What do you see now? What questions will you ask now? So that is a major theme running through my whole semester. So it's a way to kind of bring that up and make them accountable for what they learned before. And after about October, they go, you're not going to let me forget that, are you? No, we use this. There's a reason why I taught you that. And I'm going to make you use it from now on. So that is a huge theme that runs through is I always bring up whatever we learned before, I'm going to make you do it again. So they know that they are accountable for what we do throughout the year. So that's a huge way to go, oh. Not only that, I like to bring in lots of outside influences. So I'm a big one for looking at the news, looking at CNN and all those things. Anything that shows biology
Like
in the real world.
the relevance of what they're doing in the classroom.
And so we will bring those in, and I go, hey, this is what happened this week. Where do you see this in this article? What's going on? And so they'll look at that and they'll go, oh crap, that happened this week? Really? Wait, that's biology outside. Cool. So it makes it more relevant to their lives because I'm going, this really happened. Do me a favor. I don't tell them somebody Google this for me, but they do start Googling. No way, that didn't happen. And you can have them. I know I've seen other teachers say, yeah, have them Google this stuff for you and have them look it up, and it makes it more real to them. So the thematic theme, the thematic idea where we always keep using stuff, and the idea of relevancy is really huge in my classroom to make sure that they understand that you're always going to use this, not only in this year, but I'm hoping that you walk out of this classroom and go, I'm going to remember that for forever because I saw that here.
So it's been reinforced so many times too.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the downsides, to having maybe a unit is it's on the unit test and then it goes away. Maybe it reappears on the final.
Right.
But after that, it for sure goes away.
It's gone.
I do feel lucky in English because a lot of our skills are ones that they've already been taught. It's a matter of reinforcing those, and I would say showing them the next level. So even if we talk about writing at the beginning of the year, we're really reinforcing what they allegedly learned in previous years.
Yes.
But then really what changes is just the sophistication. Now we're going to write a little bit lengthier. We're going to look at a text that is maybe a little bit harder to analyze, but apply that same skill.
Yeah.
I think what I want to think about too is I've tried some things this year that on paper I'm like, this is a great idea. Like, how could they not be engaged in this? And then I found that their willingness to really get involved with it in an interesting way has been diminished. So that's another thing I think about, is just the flexibility. Like, how do I read a classroom, and even if I really like something or think it should work, when it doesn't, am I flexible enough to pivot away from that and try something different?
And two, the thing is, you guys have so many books that this is what we're doing.
Right.
You don't have a lot of leeway there. In that case, what I would tell you to look at, this would be a good place to do those neat little surveys. What are you guys interested in this year? What do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to da-da-da-da-da? And then try and find some relevancy between their likes and what you're doing. And granted, you won't pull in all the kids at the same time, but hopefully throughout the year, you'll pull in one or two and get them invested in what you're doing. If you're noticing that there's no relationship between what they like and what you're doing, that's the time when you have to supplement with what you do. Because most of my class is supplemental. I have the content, but I don't really use my book. I think we might open the book once or twice throughout the year, and that's really just to see some pictures. And then everything else I do comes from something I've seen in the internet in the past 5 years. So try and reach that way. And that's when when you talk to the kids and you start to become allies and things like that, and you're getting that info, that's where you grab that info from, as they're doing that. So let's see, like, what book are you on right now?
So with my sophomores, we're reading one called Darkness Before Dawn, which is a fiction text about a number of things that high schoolers may encounter. Most important of which in the text is sexual violence.
And this being, we just finished Sexual Assault Month, that would be a case where you could do, and here I am thinking interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
You could do graphs and things. And now that we've done this book, here's a graph. Can you tell me, did you see something in this graph from this book? Is it the same as what's in this graph? Because this came from recent statistics, you guys. Is it the same as in this book? Why don't you write me a quick essay or a quick explanation of how it's the same in the book? And I want you to use these elements in your response to me. So that way you're reinforcing what you're doing, the content of what you want them to say. And now it's based on something that's real and relevant to them. So it is that match of what my kids want to see with what I want them to learn. And I'm going to use what I want them to learn to have them tell me about their world and tell me about what's going on in there. And that's how I get to know my kids better. And it's a win-win for both of us. I don't usually say win-win,
Right.
but it is a win-win for both of us, because I have you now discussing content while you're telling me about your life, and you don't even realize that you're actually doing what I want you to do. So it's a tough thing to do in the beginning, because it does take a lot of planning. And I've noticed for people that have never done anything like that, it's hard, because you kind of have to do that creative thing where you go around the problem instead of, the generic way that we've done it all along.
Right.
I did that for so many years, and the kids, they hate science. They're like, I'm not good at it, I can't do it. Okay, well, I can't have you doing that in the science class.
Kind of
We're all gonna
reapproach
fail.
this then.
I gotta reapproach this. I gotta find a way to make it interesting enough for you to sit in my class and only maybe once or twice a week you're on your phone.
Yeah.
I gotta keep you involved,
Yeah.
and I have to play that role for you. And once I get you hooked, for the most part, the kids are like, oh yeah, you know. But you don't catch everybody, and you know, I'm not a miracle worker, but I take that time to work that around and work it through pretty much every year. I'm going, no 2 years are the same for me. And granted, they're not the same for any teacher, but I may introduce a new article and now I gotta figure out where it fits and how I'm gonna introduce it and how I'm gonna use it. And that takes time. That takes my prep time to figure out how this is gonna work and my prep time to find that. So I never get a break, which for some people is no. I'm already planned. I have my
I did this last year. I would repeat it again.
Right, and it worked well.
Right.
But could it work better?
Yeah. It's the important question.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for taking time to share some of the wisdom.
I hope
we've-
that helps.
All right, hey Patty.
Hello.
So I wanted to talk about accessing the content, and there's a lot that I explored about this, but it's also, I think, one that is one of the more challenging things too. So I'll just get right to like one of the things that we've recently discussed as a class or as a staff in our book discussions, because this just came up in the book. But as far as accessing the content goes, like understanding students they're learning something, and they're learning a lot of some things at home, just who they are and their view on education and on everything. And then one of the things Hammond recommends is kind of drawing on these funds of knowledge that students are coming into the school with. And so I kind of think I know what she means by that, but this is also what I was trying to learn more about, was how to do that. So that's what I wanted to especially like focus on, was how do we understand like what a student already knows or is like comes like prepared to learn or to click with, because we can get to know students, we can give like those start of the year, like get to know you surveys, we can have a lot of conversations with kids and kind of understand that. But I feel, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I feel like there's a gap between just getting to know someone and then really like tapping into what they know and what they can do and what they're interested in for the purpose of helping them achieve the outcomes that we actually want them to. And then it goes a level further with when you think of their culture as well, where you can do like surface level culture stuff. I read a book and it has a Hispanic protagonist in it. You know, I feel like that's checking a box, but I feel like there's kind of a deeper level of kind of speaking their language, so to speak, that is a little harder to make tangible. So I'm throwing a lot into this, but that's what I've been exploring, and I was wondering if, just from your reading of Hammond, just any insights that you have about how to better like just connect with and draw out these elements of students that we can then interweave with our academic objectives.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. There was a lot in there, you know, and then I'm like, yes. But one thing, you know, you mentioned it, like, you know, the whole get to know you thing, especially this past year, we've really highlighted that for the social emotional side, you know, but then there's this academic component, you know, the whole equity piece of getting to know your kids and then leveraging that to help us make sure that they can access our content. And those inventories of getting to know our kids, you know, we can continue doing those, but with the purpose of making sure kids can access our content and making sure that we know what their prior knowledge is, but still do it with maybe focused questions or conversations that we can have at the beginning of class, or preload them with some information that we can use to draw out what they already know. And that can help us with our instruction to figure out, you know, where the kids are lacking, or maybe they're already there. So I think those, you know, inventories of getting to know our kids can still be very purposeful, but maybe looked at not just from the social emotional side, but content-wise. And, you know, keeping it conversational about, and even tying it into conversations at home. I'm thinking about this summer, I'm teaching consumer ed, which I haven't taught in forever, and the kids will be remote. I'm already thinking of having the kids do a flip grid, and this is where the equity piece comes in, but I would love to give the kids like a 20 seconds, you know, an adult in your house, a piece of financial advice that they want to give to all the kids in class.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want to do like a match game. Well, how many parents said the same thing?
Right.
You know, and it'll just be interesting to hear what all the parents say, but I know that some kids might not want to have their parents on screen, might have trouble scheduling with them. But
If it were my
that
kid, I'd try to
connection-
give some snarky remarks.
you know what, I would support that. I would love it. Humor goes a long way. But definitely, you know, getting to know the kids, but trying to be very purposeful and creative, finding creative ways to go about that beyond the traditional, you know, Google form.
Mm-hmm. Or like, here's your worksheet and here's your test, and like, let's go engage with this now in your life, so you can see like what we're learning about has relevance elsewhere. And I think it's also like the reverse too, what you're saying, like what you see elsewhere has relevance to what we're working on too.
Yes. And that is a big part of what, you know, Zaretta talks about. And I think, you know, in teaching, we've always done, we want to make those connections, but they're just, when that ball kind of goes back and forth between different topics, you know, and then all of a sudden we see them coming together, like that ball is going like this, you know, it's all related about good instruction and good teaching, but making those connections to the real world and then the world that the kids live in at home, but just having to understand that as best we can. The thing also that really stuck out with me with Zaretta, and it was kind of controversial, that whole collectivism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and again, not taking it at the base level, like, oh, well, you are Hispanic, so that means that you know, want
You
to
must
hear a song.
do this, and you think this.
Yeah,
So-
that we need to do this for you, you know. But the general idea and of keeping that in mind and looking at Zaretta's proposed lesson plan, it's something worth trying and considering. And when I think back, you know, to lessons that I've done traditionally, and now when I look at them, how could I possibly change it? And instead of it being, you know, is there an opportunity maybe for kids to talk more with other kids in the class, where traditionally I would have done the talking, I would have done more controlling, feeling that I was scaffolding and building up the kids and giving them everything they need and then setting them off. You know, I think there's definitely value in relooking at those things and embedding some more time for kids to talk to each other, doing some more brainstorming and giving them more time. And I just don't want to say work together, because that's not, you know, they need some direction.
There's so much more that goes into it than just
Right.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, that's where my mind is going more, and it's not something that's earth-shattering, you know, but it's more of that mindset of going into it, and that whole me doing all the work and setting them up. You know, how can I reframe that, and thinking about, like, this is how I've done it for years, but, and it's worked relatively well. But when I look at my grade book, like even right now, oh my gosh, it's all of my, you know, black and brown students.
And I think that's one thing that we, you know, I've been thinking about this a lot, where it's like I have student and I have the work or the task, and I'm like, you just put the two together and something is supposed to happen from that. Whereas really, I see it more as this process, and we know this, right? There's the scaffolding and the activating the background knowledge and the anticipation and the routines and everything, the kind of the culture of the classroom. And so it's a little bit more of this gap between what you want students to do and the student, and helping kind of build some of those elements to get them to understand and have that ownership and involvement with the work.
Yes, and like what you described, like, with, you know, the hand gestures, has been so much harder with this past year, obviously. But
Right, there's so many things where like I'm trying here and it's just not, I'm not getting out of it what I feel like I could.
But then, you know, I have a student who many of us know in the building, you know, Brandon Gorman, he's shown up in person now 3 times. And another young lady who was in person for like a week and a half, Cassandra Torres, who I just met, and then Isaac, you know, all of them not doing well, but in person, oh my gosh, like they're getting it because this is shrinking. And with 2 of them, they need support.
Yeah.
And they just, it was really, really, really hard to do that to a black screen,
Yeah.
you know, and to get them to even show up on the screen and to meet, you know, it's harder to get away from me in person.
Yeah.
But, you know, in person is that connection, and it's so much easier to do a lot of these things that Zaretta, you know, suggests, and what we know good teaching is all about.
Right. Yeah, a lot of my conversations have been peppered with the phrase "next year."
Yes. Totally. And well, even like this summer, like I said, I know that I'll be teaching remote, like all the kids. So I won't feel like divided between, you know, the screen and the 5 kids I have. But I'm already re-envisioning, you know, some of my lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'll have a more captive audience, because summer school is a choice. And I'm going to remind them that. So they better be perfect.
You chose to be here.
Yes, they paid to be here. But I see it as another great opportunity, you know, to level up and try and be the best online virtual teacher they've had, you know, because we've got a year and a half of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And now, like, just equity being top of mind. And I'm really going to take time looking at my roster, the kids. I probably won't know any of them, but, you know, looking at as much information that I can, and then coming up with a great inventory, you know, beyond surface level get to know you stuff, but stuff that might really lend itself to me getting a peek into their life a little bit more without, you know, I don't want to offend anyone or be too nosy.
Right.
But I will be
Just enough with what they
right.
choose to.
And of course, you know, what they choose to share with me.
Mhm.
And at the same time, keeping a survey short, because I know if it's too long,
Right.
they'll lose interest,
Right.
or they won't.
I'll do after this.
So as we know, teaching is an art, not a science.
Mhm.
So it's always work in progress.
Yeah.
But I think for us, it's always work in we are putting in the work, and we recognize that there's work to be done, and it's always continuing.
That's been the recurring idea in a lot of these conversations, is like it is ongoing, but also it's work. Like it is work, as in like it is not easy. It requires effort and attention.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been, I think, it's good to say. I think we sense that in some ways, but now we're starting to recognize that it doesn't just happen, and we can't rely, like you said, on just our intuition or what we did last year. It takes effort. Thanks for spending some time with me to talk through this. And I know we're scratching the surface, but plenty more conversations to come.
Yeah, well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Perfect.
To what extent is it valuable to feature error, celebration, and like the freedom to fail? And to what extent does that kind of inhibit maybe just the student level of engagement and motivation because school stinks and we make everything about it great?
There's a lot going on in that question, so I want to thank you for giving me a question that will take a book to answer, but I will try. I feel like a lot of underneath all of that is the perception of the transactional nature of school. Like, I student produce thing, you teacher evaluate thing and give me grade, right? And so much of their schooling up by the time they get to us has been transactional, or so much schooling is transactional that they don't see the value in mistakes because the value comes in the grade that I give them, you know? And so this is where I think school has really fostered compliance instead of engagement, transaction instead of inquiry. And in order to combat that, you have to deprogram that whole mentality in your classroom. So, and it's very intentional and it's very scary because there's this perception, this runs counter to like keeping stakeholders, you know, involved in the decision making and involved in how they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to orient all of your stakeholders to a reorientation of the class before you can even get to like the celebration of mistakes, right? So you'll have to communicate to parents like, you're not going to see grades until X time. And even then, those are malleable and flexible. Special ed case managers, counselors, administrators, anybody who's looking at the grade book needs to know what they're looking at and what you're trying to sort of foster in the classroom. So before you can even get, in my opinion, to mistake sort of celebration, you have to, when you're thinking about your own teaching, how am I going to create an environment that fosters inquiry? How am I going to create an environment that makes kids want to make mistakes in the first place? How do I deprogram the transactional nature of school? And that is a work in progress for me as a teacher. And it's certainly difficult with other teachers as I coach, because so much of what they do is transactional, right? Like, you are a member of this PLT, you are obligated to give this type 3, this type 2. We have to give type 3s for evaluation. You have a DBA, you have a final, you have all of these sort of like transactions that you have to try and fit that square peg into that round hole. I believe that that's doable. I really do, but it requires some, well, thoughtful deprogramming, right? Mm-hmm. So when you finally get them to a point where they understand, like, the grade isn't going to happen, feedback will happen, information will flow, but not grades per se, then it becomes about orienting students to you getting yourself oriented to them and their interests, and starting to really build an environment where they are interested in participating, not because you're going to give them a grade, but because they're actually interested in something. And for kids who, again, have been so programmed by the transactional nature of school, that can be A, very difficult, and B, super disorienting, because you have to get kids to trust themselves as learners and take themselves seriously as learners, which some kids do, like at the drop of a hat, they're super pumped. And some kids are like, me? What? No, that's not me. In fact, it's all of us, because that's the very nature of the humans that inhabit this planet. They're curious, right? That's why we went to the moon and why we dug deep into the ground, So I think that finding that energy for curiosity is the most important part. And then orienting everybody away from the transactional nature of school and towards that curiosity and inquiry, that's when the magic can happen. So I don't think there's a strategy or like a worksheet or like a graphic organizer that'll do that. But like you're doing right now, lots of like conversations about what they value and what they find important will be well on your way.
Yeah, I mean, I've done things for practice, and we all have over the years, and there's no intention of evaluating it. But at the end of almost every one of those, there's at least one student who's like, well, why did I just do this if it's not going to be graded? And I like how you mentioned scary right off the bat, because it is scary for both parties to kind of get into this territory where it's like, well, I'm like, we're going to use this as a tool. We're going to practice this skill. You still may get feedback on it, but at the end of the day, like this isn't going into the grade book, because that's still forthcoming. But how can I assess what you can do before we've really like practiced how to do it, before we've rehearsed that, before we've wrestled with it? I use that word a lot. Before we fumbled a little bit, and then we can really see what you can do. I was at my kids' soccer practice a little while ago, and like it's the opposite. You only keep score once a week at the game, and at practices, we get on their case and they're getting tons of feedback, but they're just doing the same thing over and over again, and there's really no stakes. So I'm trying to just imagine, like, how can we bring that, and it's fun, for them too. But how can we bring that into the classroom and feel like, okay, I can engage with this task and, maybe have some fun with this and play with this until I get to a point where I'm comfortable enough to get to the big game where there will be some degree of evaluation. But I think that's where I've struggled, is just feeling like, this is something we can do. So one thing I tried was, like, sometimes I'll give students like 3 assignments in a row. And then after those 3, I'll say, all right, now pick one, and that's going to be the one that you finalize and submit for, an official grade, per se. And that's been a little bit more successful, because at least they feel like there's some they're working towards the transaction. They can see where that's coming. But there are a lot of other elements too, where I'm like, I wish that it were a little easier to get to that point where I can have you do this task with authenticity without feeling like it has to be graded.
Mhm. I'm going to go back to your soccer practice example. Why do your kids go to soccer practice?
So we asked them what sport they wanted to play, and they said they chose soccer.
They wanted to go, right? They
Mhm.
like it. And I think that we overlook that, but that is probably the most important thing. Like, we're willing to fail at things we're interested in failing at, or that we're interested in, period. Like, the failure doesn't necessarily bother me in soccer. Well, it would bother me in soccer practice because I don't like soccer, but you know what I mean? Like, I don't feel as exposed because it's something I want to do. And so it's less scary. So I guess the question becomes, how can we make our English classrooms like soccer practice for your kids? How can we make it so that they want to be there? And that's difficult to do with like moody teenagers, so to speak.
Right.
But
And
even those,
compulsory education and graduation requirements. And
right.
and really exposed.
Compulsory public education is radical. So I love when people say we should keep politics out of school. I'm like, school is politics. We just said everybody was entitled to an education. Like, you don't think that's political, but okay, fine. But so like compulsory education in and of itself is radical. And so how do you then cater to those that truly don't think they want to be there? But I would argue that the kids that don't want to be there have had the least opportunity to have their interests catered to. I firmly believe that. I've seen it. And for some, and even Dr. Hammond will tell you, we saw her live and in person, and she'll say that by the time they get to high school, this is an uphill battle and virtually impossible to change by the time they get to junior year, which is when I am most of my students. And so then you have that so deeply entrenched notion of transactional school and disaffect it, and like, I'm not a good student, or I'm not good enough here, I'm not seen here, that it's almost impossible to combat that. Still, we're trying, obviously. But I think too, when we start thinking about what choices we make, how can we make our classrooms more like soccer practice so that there's a willingness to struggle? How can we make them choose? And I think giving them the choice of what you evaluate is absolutely a step in that direction, because they need some autonomy, right? They need some autonomy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I feel like we're, Scratch. I actually have a long list of other like cognitive related elements that we could dive into as well. But this is the one from the list that maybe has been that thorn in the flesh for the longest, I think, for me, because it seems so attainable, but also so different, so radical. So I thank you for your time to help me just talk through and articulate and understand what it is that we're striving for with that. I appreciate any moment that I can steal the great